So tonight we'll cover chapters 8 and 9, which is a lot to put in one hour lesson, but we'll hit the high points and I'll put all kinds of extra articles and videos and resources for you in the video description in case you'd like to learn more. So first, let's think about the overview of what's happening in chapters 8 and 9. So we've already finished chapters 1 through 6, which is all about the life and adventures of Daniel and his friends. And what I'll do right now is I'll share my screen. I have the really helpful timeline that Brenda Heller shared with us, and it's the outline of Daniel. Can you guys all see that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if you look on the bottom, you've got the timeline of years. So we're in BCs, before Christ. So we're around 500 years before Christ. And in the blue is Babylon on the bottom of your timeline, where it has Nebuchadnezzar's reign, and then you see Belshazzar right there. So that is where we're at in chapter 8. Chapter 9 is at a different time in a different kingdom. So it almost seems like we're skipping around a little bit. In chapter 8, with the ram and the goat, which we'll talk about first tonight, that's still during the reign of Belshazzar. Remember the handwriting on the wall from chapter 5? We're pre-chapter 5. So I know it seems like we would be after at this point, but the book of Daniel is not necessarily chronological. And so we are in the third year of Belshazzar, which is 2 years after chapter 7, but all of that's still before what happened in chapter 5. Are you with me?
Mm-hmm.
It's a little convoluted, but I think this timeline really does help clarify where we're at. So Brenda, thanks again for sharing this. When we get to chapter 9, we'll be in the next kingdom after Babylon. We'll be in the Medes and Persians, which is down here in yellow on the timeline. And that is Daniel's prayer chapter, and where it talks about the 70 weeks. So this is where we're at least on the timeline. And that will help us keep track of what events happen when. So we will take a look at some maps as well tonight to compare the different empires, because we're about to see Daniel's vision of empires changing again. So it's like chapter 2 on repeat. So last week when we talked, or 2 weeks ago, sorry, when we talked about Daniel chapter 7, that mirrored chapter 2. And so now we're mirroring chapter 2 again in chapter 8. So even though it's different beasts and a different setting, the meaning is still very much the same. So let's start in chapter 8. We'll go through and hit the high points, and I'll have some pictures and things to show you as we go through. So if you're taking notes, I'll go in order in the chapter. So to start with, we're back in the Hebrew language now. Remember how the middle of the book, we switched to Aramaic because it had to do with the court scenes and working with the kings. So yeah, we're back in Hebrew now because it's just Daniel in the first person talking about what's happening. Because here in verse 1, it says, I, Daniel, had a vision. So I actually have Bible Gateway pulled up. So I've got my screen kind of split between Zoom and Bible Gateway. So that's kind of helpful. So in my vision, he says in verse 2, I saw myself in the citadel of Susa in the province of Elam. In the vision, I was beside the Ulai Canal. Canals were really important to the cities. That's what brought in water and diverted water to the cities. And so that actually was used by archaeologists to help identify Susa in the 1800s when they went to dig it up. So very interesting. There's a little bit left of Darius's palace there today. I learned about it when I was researching for Esther for the women's conference a couple of years ago. And so anyway, Daniel in his vision, so he was in Babylon, but the vision metaphorically took him to Susa. He probably didn't actually travel. It was about 200 miles away. In fact, I'll show you the map here. So if we go to the Babylonian Empire on our map, so you can orient yourself. There's the Mediterranean Sea on the left. The Black Sea is at the top, up north of Turkey, modern day Turkey. The Caspian Sea is north of modern day Iran. And so now you can see where the Empire of Babylon was. So Daniel was still in the Babylonian Empire in this book, even though his vision actually looks ahead. So you can see Babylon right here by the star, and the red dashed line is the route the exiles might have taken to go from Jerusalem to Babylon. So that gives you a point of reference there. So Susa is way out east, very far east in what's modern day Iran. And so that later is where the Persians, the Medes and the Persians come from, is from in this area in modern day Iran. So Daniel's vision takes him in his mind from Babylon to Susa. Okay, so I looked up and there before me was a ram with two horns in verse 3. One of the horns was longer than the other, but grew up later. What does that mean? So we start with, again, we're seeing animals or beasts of the field symbolizing different kingdoms. Now, Daniel is already in Babylon, but when he begins this vision, is actually a vision about, not about Babylon. Babylon is on the decline at this point. He's at the end of Belshazzar's reign. And so what comes after Babylon in the dream statue? I have that picture if you want to go look at it, actually. So let's refresh our memory from chapter 2 and 7 with this statue drawing. So Babylon is at the top. It was gold. So now we see the Medes and the Persians come next. They were the chest and arms of silver. And then, we've got the bronze representing Greece. So in chapter 8, you see the ram and the goat. That represents the Medes and Persians and Greece. So those are the two we're going to focus. We're going to zoom in on those two earthly kingdoms in chapter 8. Okay. So one of the horns was longer than the other, but grew up later. I watched the ram as it charged toward the west and the north and the south. No animal could stand against it, and none could rescue from its power. It did as it pleased and became great. Okay, so that is the ram. Next, he suddenly sees a goat with a prominent horn between its eyes. It came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. It came toward the two-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal and charged it in great rage. I saw it attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering its two horns. The ram was powerless to stand against it. The goat knocked it to the ground and trampled on it, and none could rescue the ram from its power. The goat became very great, but at the height of its power, the large horn was broken off, and in its place, 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. Okay, we're going to stop there. That's a lot to take in. Okay, so we've got a ram and we've got a goat. But again, if you were in Daniel's time, you would have recognized these symbols as representing specific things. So in other words, this isn't necessarily something we have to decipher. We need to look at the symbols of the time and then match it up. Luckily, if you skip to the end, you know that the angel Gabriel comes and interprets for Daniel, and he tells him exactly who it represents. So if you've already read the end of the chapter, you know that the ram represents who? What kingdom?
Kings of Media and Persia.
Yes, Media and Persia. So the ram is Media and Persia. Now, again, it had those 2 horns, one was longer than the other. Think back to chapter 7 when we drew this out. It was the bear, right? Was it the bear that represented Persia? You guys remember that? And it was on its side, symbolizing that one side of the kingdom was stronger than the other. Remember, Persia was the stronger of the two, stronger than the Medes. Okay, so here we have that same meaning, but in different symbols. So this ram has two horns, one's longer than the other. It means the exact same thing as chapter 7. And so when it talks about west, north, and south, that goes back to our map. So Persia, remember the handwriting on the wall, Persia came in 539 BC and took over Babylon. And when they did that, so here's the Babylonian Empire. We'll start there. Cyrus comes in 539, takes over, and this becomes the Medo-Persian Empire. We just call it the Persian Empire for short. But look how much bigger it is. This was the biggest empire of its time in world history, period. Huge. It went all the way to India, and then all the way to parts of modern day Greece, and even into North Africa. So Cyrus and others conquered much more territory toward the west. And to the north, all the way up to Armenia, up to Bactria, and then south. South meant Egypt. So again, if you were in that time, you would have known who controlled what powers, what earthly kingdoms. Well, Cyrus the Great came in and just expanded the empire. That's what the ram is doing when it says west, north, and south. So if that's the ram, who is the goat? The goat defeated the ram. And if you follow this logic of the chapter 2 statue, Greece would have defeated Persia. So the goat represents Greece. So let's look closely at the description. Again, I'm looking in chapter 8, verse 5. So that's where the goat's introduced. It came from the west. On our map, Greece is to the west of Babylon and Persia. So it came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. That's a metaphor for speed, because Alexander the Great came and conquered Persia in about 11 years, which was unheard of for the amount of ground that he covered to take over. And so, again, suddenly a goat shows up. Alexander the Great came out of nowhere, seemingly. So, again, with hindsight, we can see that this vision came true in real life, and that many of the details follow historically with what actually happened. So it came toward the two-horned ram, charged at it furiously. So Persia and Greece fought against each other viciously. So if you think forward to like Queen Esther, Xerxes had a huge campaign against Greece right before the beginning of Esther chapter 1. Well, and right after he deposed Vashti, he went off to battle. He came back, and that's when they brought in Esther. Greece and Persia did not get along very well at all. Persia wanted all of Greece. Greece said no, and then came Alexander the Great, and then he conquered Persia later. Okay, so the goat became very great, but at the height of its power, the large horn was broken off. That large horn represented Alexander the Great. Horns represent power in these symbols. And so in place of Alexander the Great, 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. Okay, so Alexander the Great dies at the age of 33. And his empire, the Greek Empire, was split between his 4 main generals, right? You had Lysimachus, Cassander, Ptolemy, and Seleucus. And I talk about those in my Daniel chapter 2 video, if you need to go back and have a refresh. But those 4 generals took over the 4 parts of the empire. So this is what Alexander the Great's territory looked like. And so Ptolemy went and took over Egypt. And Seleucus took over Syria, and a little bit more than that. And then the other 2 generals didn't have as much land. We don't talk about them as much. They took over other areas. But what we're going to find, especially in chapter 9, this becomes very important who those 4 generals are, because they war against each other, and that causes the events of chapter 9 to take place. We'll get there in a minute. Okay, so back up to chapter 8. So in chapter 8, verse 8, Alexander the Great dies, his 4 generals take over. Those are the horns. Okay. Out of one of them came another horn. So out of those 4, another one popped up. So it's related to those 4, which started small, but grew in power to the south and to the east and toward the beautiful land, which is another word for Palestine, or what we call Israel. Okay, so another power came from, it turns out it came from the Seleucids. His name was Antiochus IV Epiphanes. We'll just call him Antiochus. So he's introduced in verse 9 here in chapter 8 as a horn which started out small. Remember, he ruled Syria. He actually stole it from another member of the family, and grew in power. Verse 10, it grew until it reached the host of the heavens. Oh, I forgot to say, back up on verse 8, the 4 winds of heaven. We've seen that idiom before in the book of Daniel. The 4 winds of heaven, that was the beginning of chapter 7. I think Julie drew that. Remember, the sea and the 4 winds? It just means that they took over as far as the eye can see. But then this little horn comes, and verse 10, it grew until it reached the host of heavens, and it threw some of the starry hosts down to the earth and trampled them. There's debate about what that means, but it could be holy ones from God. It's part of the heavenly host, part of the spiritual warfare aspect of this. It set itself up to be as great as the commander of the army of the Lord, of God himself. So this ruler wanted to be as powerful as the God of heaven. It took away the daily sacrifice from the Lord, and his sanctuary was thrown down. Because of rebellion, the Lord's people and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. And it prospered in everything it did, and truth was thrown to the ground. He was the ruler of Syria at the time when he was a small ruler, but he had his sights set on Egypt, which one of the other generals commanded, the Ptolemies. That was under their line. He wanted that, but to get there, he needed Palestine, or what we call Israel. They called Palestine back then. And so to get Palestine, he needed the Jews who lived there. Well, rather than working with them, he basically said, you know what? I want to convert Jerusalem to a Greek center of culture, and I want all of you Jews to become Greek citizens.
Which one was this now?
This is still the same guy.
Oh.
Same guy. Yeah. We're not going to talk about any other guys. It's all about him now.
Okay.
Good question. So he had this big vision of making making Jerusalem a Greek center of culture. So he brought in a statue of Zeus to install in the temple, in God's holy temple in Jerusalem. So he actually walked into the temple anytime he wanted. He walked into the Holy of Holies, which, remember, to the Jews, only the high priest could go in there once a year. But Antiochus just waltzes right in there at his leisure. And so he puts a statue of Zeus in there and says people need to stop praying to God. They need to worship Zeus. And so he puts a pagan altar on top of the altar that was there at the temple, and he sacrificed a pig on the altar. And if you remember the Jewish food laws, were they allowed to eat pigs?
No.
Nope. That was the ultimate sacrilege, having an idol of a foreign god in the temple and then sacrificing unclean food on the altar, sacrificing it to Zeus, let alone. It gets worse. It gets much, much worse than this. He actually had the high priest murdered so that he could put his own high priest in place, who was not a descendant of Aaron, mind you. He was not a Levite, which again, that was a requirement for high priest. There's a whole drama, soap opera around this time period, and with what happened with the high priest. So the original high priest was deposed. He brought in a new one, and then his brother took it. I mean, and then there was like a bidding war for the high priest, and the guy that was not a descendant of Aaron won the bidding war. Antiochus got him in as high priest because he was sympathetic to the Greeks. He allowed Greek culture and Greek practices to come into the temple as high priest. So if you are a loyal Jew, how would that make you feel? Just beside yourself. Yes, horrible. But we're not done. There's more. Oh boy, this just gets worse. He outlawed all Jewish practices, no rituals, so no daily sacrifices, no morning sacrifice of lambs, no afternoon sacrifice, no grain offerings, no sacrifices. He did not allow them to celebrate Jewish feasts. That was outlawed. He did not allow baby boys to be circumcised, and he would kill the parents if he found out that they did. He also had his men search out every copy of the Torah and destroy it. No one was allowed to study the Torah, period. Which there weren't a lot of copies circulating, but still. So at this time, they really had to rely on their oral tradition to get them through this. This was about, I think, 3.5 years that this lasted. This was intense persecution of God's people. At the same time, and it says in verse 12, the truth was thrown to the ground. That's referring to the Torah being outlawed, because the Torah is God's truth. Antiochus was not having it, so he got rid of all of that. He was basically trying to erase the Jewish culture to bring in the Greek, the Hellenistic culture. So he also, on top of all of this, he also used the temple treasury to fund his military campaign to Egypt. Yikes.
May I ask a quick question?
Yes, please do.
Is this when Egypt was along the Mediterranean Sea there? Is this when Egypt extended all the way up?
Here, let me get our map. Do you mean?
I mean, it's making sense to me. I've never known when Egypt no longer had that land.
Do you mean right here in Egypt that's highlighted yellow?
No, on all the way where Judea and Syria are.
Yeah.
Egypt went all up in there,
Oh,
but I
yes.
don't know when.
Yes.
So at this time, that's where they are.
Yes, and that's what he wanted.
Egypt. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't exactly
That
know
makes
what
sense now.
the boundary line is, but yeah. Palestine
Okay.
was a separate area within that. And there were times in is it First and Second Kings when Egypt controlled the area. So at the moment, if you remember in earlier chapters, Babylon defeated Egypt at the Battle of Carchemish. So Egypt doesn't actually own any of that, at least at the time of Daniel, like at the beginning of Daniel. But to get to Egypt, you have to go through Palestine. So I don't know where the dividing line exactly is, and these maps aren't clear. So I'd have to do some more research to know for sure. That's a
Well,
fascinating.
it all makes sense now, but
Okay, that's good. That's good. I'll stop talking before I muddy the waters more. Okay, so yes. Also, in verse 12, it says, because of rebellion, the Lord's people and the daily sacrifices were given over to it. Something you should know that was also happening at the same time was a culture war between the Jewish sects of thought. There were two groups of Jews at this point. There were the Hebraic Jews, the very orthodox, very traditional, very conservative Jews who did not accept the influence of other cultures. There were also a group of Greek Jews or Hellenistic Jews who said, you know what, Greek culture is pretty great. It's okay to do both. So you have those two very different schools of thought here warring against each other in a culture war at the same time all of this is happening. Because again, if you are Orthodox, if you are very, almost fundamentalist, Hebrew at this time, you want God as your king. You want no pictures on your money. Those were considered idols. You don't want to serve any foreign oppressors, right? You just want your piece of land, the promised land, Canaan, or as we're calling here, Palestine. You just want that under God's rule, and everyone follows the old law. And that's not what was happening because of the Greek influence. And now that you have a ruler who is Greek and bringing in all of this Greek culture, you had some who thought, this is heresy. We are not following God if we bring in other cultural aspects to our worship into our daily life. And so those two conflicting viewpoints were coming to a head at the same time. And then you have Antiochus, who brings in his own high priest, basically, who is sympathetic to the Greeks. And you have a very, very difficult time. The people were beside themselves, and it actually started a rebellion. And we don't read about it in the Old Testament, but we do read about it in the Apocrypha. Is anybody familiar with that term, Apocrypha? A couple might be. It actually happens in between the Old Testament and the New Testament, right? There's like 400 years of silence between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. In that period were a bunch of apocryphal writings, and some of those detail what was happening during this revolt that happened in real life. So remember, Daniel's having this vision right now, but it actually came to pass around the year 150 BC. And Antiochus lived in that time period. And that's when all of this happened. And there was a revolt led by Judas Maccabeus. And if you hang on, let me look at my notes here. So that was written about in it's called First Maccabees and Second Maccabees. And those are two books within the Apocrypha or the apocryphal writings. in Catholic Bibles, they do include that as part of their canon. Most Protestants do not. And again, some Jewish groups do include it, some do not. So it's a gray area, but we can still glean some historical information from that, including the story of the revolt against Antiochus. The Maccabees led the Jews to push Antiochus out of Palestine, and that guy that he had made the high priest pushed them all out and liberated Palestine. And as part of that, they had to go into the temple, which had been desecrated by the statue of Zeus and pagan offerings on the altar. And what they did was, when they went in the temple, they only found one jar of oil, olive oil, which was used to light the menorah. They lit it, and it turned out that that one jar of oil that normally would have only lasted one day lasted 8 days. Does this story start to sound familiar?
Hanukkah.
Yes, it's Hanukkah. And, some people call it the Festival of Lights because they were able to light the menorah in the temple. It's also called the Feast of Dedication, which we read about in the New Testament in John 22. John chapter 10, verse 22. Jesus went to the Feast of Dedication, which we know as Hanukkah. Interesting connection there, but that's beside the point. So this revolt it ushered in 100 years of self-rule for the Jews. They were their own boss for 100 years. Can you imagine how exciting that was for them, with God as their king, and they had their own self-rule. They cleansed the temple. They rededicated the temple, and were great until the Romans came. And that's when Pompey came in with his armies and took over Palestine. So they had 100 years to themselves. That's why when Jesus came, there was such an attitude, we call it a messianic fervor. They wanted somebody to come remove Rome from rule so they could have that self-rule again. So kind of a side note there. All right, so that's what's happening in chapter 8. Daniel has this vision of the ram and the goat, of Persia and Greece fighting. Greece wins and becomes the new earthly kingdom in power. And so that little horn that pops up, as we look back in history, scholars agree on this, like almost unanimously. That little horn represents Antiochus, who came in and tried to remove Jewish culture and the Torah and daily sacrifices. So what happened to him? Well, I mean, I know that, I said the Maccabees came and did self-rule for a while, but what happened to that guy? What happened to Antiochus IV? Interestingly, he came down with a disease, a very painful disease, and he died. And so it actually talks about here in chapter 8. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to him, "How long will it take for this vision to be fulfilled? The vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation, the surrender of the sanctuary, and the trampling underfoot of the Lord's people." He said to me, "It will take 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated." And I think later on it talks about how the little horn was destroyed. So
6 years and 4 months.
I'm sorry, say that again.
6 years and 4 months.
Oh, the 2,300 evenings?
Yeah.
Yes. So there are some scholars who think that's just the sum of all of the evening and the morning sacrifices added together from the time Antiochus came to power until the Maccabees rededicated the temple. So the 2300, some people think it's literal. Some scholars think it's literal in the counting of the daily sacrifices to each day during that time period. Others think that it could be a symbolic number, and it's just trying to say that the time is limited. This won't happen. This won't go on forever. God will limit the time that this ruler is in power. And so, I mean, there's no clear way to interpret it. And it doesn't really matter which direction you go. You can count. It actually does get pretty close, but it's not exact. But again, don't miss the forest through the trees. The point is it's limited. Mm-hmm. God brought him to an end. So I'm going to scroll down here in chapter 8 because he talked about how verse 25, chapter 8, verse 25, yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. So it wasn't other humans that killed him. He literally got a disease and he died. So, okay. So, Gabriel makes his debut in this chapter in Daniel. This is the first time an angel is mentioned by name in the Old Testament. Mm-hmm. That's pretty amazing. And we get to see it here in Daniel. Now, Gabriel is the same one that visited Mary in the New Testament to say that Jesus was coming. So same guy. He tends to be the messenger of God here. Okay, any questions on chapter 8? We covered a lot really fast.
Did we actually cover number 23? Was that still was that the one we're talking about too there? Okay.
Yes, same guy. Okay. I like how it describes him, a master of intrigue. Mm-hmm. He was very cunning, and another member of his family was supposed to be the ruler, but he somehow got it switched, and they became a prisoner, like a prisoner of war. Ooh. And he got to be the ruler, so he will cause astounding devastation and will succeed in whatever he does. Boy, it was complete and utter devastation of God's temple and the daily sacrifices, the whole sacrificial system. Everything was upended for those few years while he was in power.
And I know that had to be heart sickening for them.
Absolutely.
But it also says it didn't happen by his own power. God's still in control. And every once in a while, if I think about that stuff, it freaks me out today because we think that, we're sitting here and we're all cool, because we're God's chosen people, and I have prayed for forgiveness of this nation over and over and over and over and over.
Yes. That's a good segue into chapter 9, actually. Because that's exactly what Daniel does in chapter 9. So
Samantha?
Yeah, go ahead.
What history book or books did you get the information about this whatever his name is?
Antiochus. So hold on. Oh shoot, I don't have it up here. I have the complete works of Josephus, Flavius.
Okay. Okay.
So that's one.
Okay.
And that's not too bad to read, actually. Once you get into Josephus, it's kind of, he's kind of a storyteller. It's not really hard to read. I was intimidated by it for years, but it's really kind of interesting.
Well, and I have the Antiquities of Josephus.
It's in Antiquities.
Is that the one?
It's in Antiquities 12.5.4.
I haven't started reading that book yet because, like Brenda, I'm a little intimidated by it. But I'm interested in some of that. So okay, good. Thank you.
No, you're welcome. So I think some of it might be online, and if I can find it, I'll link to it and put it in the video description so you can read it.
Yeah, that'll be awesome.
But yeah, I'll cite the source so you can go find it. It's gruesome. It is.
Okay. Yeah.
It is horrific, his descriptions of this time and the revolt. He also describes something that we're going to talk about with chapter 9 too. So Josephus is kind of an important historical perspective for us on this.
Well, and I had even heard about the sacrificing the pig on the altar and the temple Zeus and everything, but I had failed to remember who that was. And so thank you for that.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So, some Christians today think that Daniel's chapter 7 to 12 is all about the end times, meaning it's all about eschatology and what's going to happen with the second coming of Jesus. But some of this
it's already
stuff
history that has happened.
Yes, we can literally see it in the history textbooks. And trace it, and it's very clear, and a lot of it is even directly explained by angels that this was Persia and this was Greece. So yeah, so chapter 8 for sure, purely historical. It's in the history books. Okay. Chapter 9 as well. Chapter 9, again, some people think it's in the future. As you'll see, a lot of this really happened right after Jesus's time, and he even talked about it. Okay, so let's get there. So I know it is 7:54 and class goes to 8. Does everybody vote to go like 7 to 10 minutes longer?
You go, girl.
Ooh, okay. If you need to go, that's totally fine. All right. One thing to wrap up chapter 8. I love how Daniel didn't just isolate himself. He was like terrified with this dream, but he pulled himself together, brushed himself off, and went right back to work. I think that's a cool application for us. But anyway, okay, on to chapter 9. We're moving forward in time. We're now in the first year of Darius. Now, nobody knows which Darius this is. There's a lot of confusion on which specific king this is. Is it Darius the First? Is it Cyrus? Is it Xerxes' dad? It doesn't matter. This has still come true anyway, despite not knowing exactly which king it was, and I'll show you why. So this chapter opens. Let me come up here. So Daniel, again, in chapter 8, was living in the Babylonian Empire at the time, but his vision was looking forward to the Greek Empire. And in chapter 9, Daniel is literally in a new kingdom. So it says Darius, son of Xerxes, a Mede, who was made ruler over the Babylonian kingdom. Okay. So Daniel chronologically has moved forward in time. And so super fast, let's share that timeline again so we can all be on the same page. So we're in chapter 9. So we've gone forward a number of years. And it is talking about the restoration of Israel. Now, Daniel was a very good student of his Bible. And now, granted, the Bible as we know it had not yet been put together. It had not yet been assembled. That happened during the Babylonian exile to get the Hebrew Bible that we know of today. That's our Old Testament. But at the time, everything was on different scrolls, not compiled. But Daniel still read. In fact, he read a letter from Jeremiah. In our Bibles, it's Jeremiah chapter 25, specifically, we'll look at verse 11. But in Jeremiah chapter 25, that's where the message from God is that Israel will be restored after 70 years. Daniel remembers this and he's like, aha, I am going to call God on this and see if he will do this, if he'll keep his word. Daniel was later rewarded for that. And so, so we know from this example, it's okay that if you read something in the Bible, you can call God on it and say, did you really mean this? I think he likes that because it means we're listening. Okay, that it would last 70 years, the desolation of Jerusalem, meaning the exile that, where Daniel and his friends were taken from Jerusalem in 586 BC and taken to Babylon. Daniel was 15 when he left. Now he's in his 80s. So it's around 70 years by now. And so Daniel says, it's about that time. But he doesn't pridefully call God on it. Look, he puts on sackcloth and ashes. That's what you wear when you're mourning. He pleaded with God in prayer and petition and fasting. In fact, he fasted so much and prayed so much, he got weak. So we have to be a little bit careful about that. And so did Daniel. The angel had to kind of refresh him here. I know that you've probably already read chapter 9, and I'm not going to dwell on the specifics of the prayer, but I will dwell on the 70 weeks. So I'm going to leave that prayer up to you to read and think about, reflect on, because it definitely is applicable to Daniel then, to Jesus in his time, to John with the revelation in his time, and with us today. Everything we learned from Daniel, it may not be written to us, but we can use the lessons and apply it to our situation today. So consider that for the nation we live in, which is at the feet of the statue from chapter 2. Okay. The 77s is what the NIV calls it. Others say 70 weeks. What I love is that in verse 20, how Gabriel says, actually in verse 23, he says, as soon as you began to pray, a word went out. I love the imagery of that, and thinking about when we speak our prayers, the word goes out. God hears our prayer. And he says, Daniel, I've now come to give you insight and understanding, for you are highly esteemed. Wow. His reputation precedes him. Okay. So then Gabriel explains what this is going to look like, what this 77s means. And again, there are people who calculate this out. I'm not going to make you do the math. So people have taken the weeks, like week by week, to figure this out. And they get to the time of Jesus and the time after Jesus, and they arrive at the destruction of the temple in AD 70. Daniel is praying about this, and Gabriel says, 77s are decreed for your people in your holy city to finish transgression. And so, verse 25, no one understand this, from the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the anointed one, the ruler, comes, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. So 7 is a week. So there'll be 7 weeks and then 62 weeks. And then 62, 7, 8 is 69 weeks. And then there's 1 more week. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. At the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation. In verse 27, your version may call it an abomination of desolation. NIV says an abomination that causes desolation, or some variation of that. What we know, again, from history, I won't go into all the details, but again, I'll put more links for you in the video description. But what we know from history is that this is most likely referring to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, when General Titus came and destroyed the city. And Jesus even foretold this in Matthew chapter 24. Jesus used the phrase abomination of desolation, or, well, he just said desolation. He didn't use the complete phrase, but scholars have linked that back from Matthew 24 here to Daniel chapter 9. And so what he's saying is, this is all about the Roman siege on Jerusalem in AD 70. Again, I'll have an article for you to read that will explain this part a little bit more in depth, because I know we're running short on time. He says, for many will come in my name claiming I am the Messiah and will deceive many, which actually did. There were multiple false messiahs wanting to be the military rulers to get rid of the Roman rule. You will hear wars and rumors of wars, but see to it, you are not alarmed. And then he says, you will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death. Yes, verse 15. So when you see standing in the holy place, the abomination that causes desolation spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Like Jesus stopped and gave a parenthetical statement. He's like, this should give you a memory, like a hyperlink, I've heard it called. You should immediately go back to Daniel and think of chapter 9. And they would have known the story of what happened. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. He's telling them to escape ahead of the Roman destruction. Let no one on the housetop go down to take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to get their cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath. It's really important. For then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. Josephus writes about the destruction of Jerusalem, and it is heartrending. I cried when I read it. It's so horrible. And for me, I've never been in a war or a war zone. All I know is what I've seen on TV or read about. But to read Josephus's description of it, and he was there. He fought. He worked with the Romans as their Jewish historian, but so it's a very gripping account. And what Jesus said came to pass. It was great distress. And what's interesting is that the Jewish Christians, the Jewish followers of Jesus who heard those words, knew about those words, they escaped. They followed his instructions and they escaped and were largely unaffected by the Roman siege in AD 70. You know who did not escape? The Jews who did not believe Jesus. And many of them died by the sword, starved to death, or the ones who survived were sold into slavery. And many of them were taken to Rome to build the Colosseum. That beautiful building of the Colosseum where they would fill it up with water and have ship navy battles, and they would have wild beasts come out. That was built by the Jewish survivors of the destruction of Jerusalem. Yikes. So it's very interesting to me that Jesus took what was written to Daniel and showed how it would come to pass. Now remember, Jesus died, in the early 30s AD. So it was another 40 years before even Jesus's words came to pass. And think, add another 500 years back to Daniel. So it takes time. God works on his own schedule. But both Daniel chapter 9 and Matthew chapter 24 both came to pass in AD 70. That's a lot to internalize in one night. And very heavy. This is not a very happy set of chapters. Okay. So again, all of this echoes chapter 2 in that first dream statue. And the whole point is to give hope to the exiles, to give hope to God's people who are in exile, whether then in Babylon with Daniel, or us today who are metaphorically or spiritually in exile from our final eternal home. And so these chapters, even though chapters 8 and 9 have a lot of distraction and a lot of persecution, the point is that God puts a limit on how much persecution he will allow his people to endure. And that even if they suffer persecution, there is still hope beyond that, because God's kingdom will come, at least to Daniel. He knows it's coming in the future. We know it has already come through Jesus, and his kingdom is eternal. God wins, period. So that's the hope we should take away from this. And we see it repeated over and over and over in history, in Daniel's dreams, in what Jesus says. I think that's pretty amazing. So these are some pretty good chapters. There's a lot of detail, a lot of symbols, but it all boils down to that, is that God wins in the end. Okay, cool. I better let you guys go. I kept you 15 minutes over.
Thank you, Sam.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Sam.
You're welcome. Thank you so much. Have a good night, guys.
Thank you very much, Sam.
Bye.